Alrighty, coming to you live here from DevOps Days Dallas Fort Worth. I'm here with Mr. Michael Cote. How are you?
I'm good.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. So you actually kicked off the whole show today with your talk. What was, if you tell the folks just what it was at a very high level?
Sure. Well, I was going over to talk about how when it comes to the stacks of the platforms that we use to run the software that organizations build and run their software, that we tend to sort of like rebuild this stack every 5 to 10 years or so. And the premise was that we're at the beginning of rebuilding this stack with Kubernetes and things like that. And that it was kind of going over like, so if we're going to be rebuilding our stack, what can we learn from the past times that we have rebuilt it? Ways that, kind of like the way that you develop that stack out, the way that you run it, kind of the frame of mind that you have so that we don't have to like reinvent everything. And the reinventing everything is not so bad. It's more, we don't have to lose time and make the mistakes. We can kind of, instead of just completely getting rid of everything and starting afresh, we can incrementally improve from where we are and help things out. And I'm remembering now, Bart, that I left off, how did I skip this slide? I must have taken it out. I had a whole jag about bimodal IT in there.
That was Gartner or IDC back in the day?
That was Gartner.
Okay.
Yeah, I forget. I wonder what happened to that slide. I better go look, and because I might have left it in Detroit.
But basically the idea that you had the fast part of the company and you also had the lagging part of the company and neither the twain shall meet.
Yeah, and that was, I mean, this is a very niche thing that doesn't exist to go into right away here, but that was the point that I was trying to make, is that you know, it's very easy as technology people, especially ones that are at a conference, to like be focused on this interesting new thing that's great and just sort of like neglect all the stuff that exists and not really like try to bring everyone along necessarily. And also like any chance I get to point out the madness several years ago that was this whole bimodal like scruffle, like I'm pretty sure most of the people complaining about it, you know, did spend the $3,000 to read the Gartner PDFs. And I don't know, it's one of those typical things of like, no one did the news story a year later. Like, did you know that while someone won a lawsuit about McDonald's, the overall settlement was actually greatly reduced at the end of the settlement, and you know, actually the coffee was extremely hot.
Right, yes. Okay, well on that, let's move on to, if you had some advice to give folks who are now trying to make this transition in this new space. As you say, we've got the Kubernetes that for some people they have started implementing. Some people, of course, like Google, they've been implementing it. How would you tell people to look at it and what should they be thinking about?
Well, I think the primary thing, especially if you're used to like, traditional is the wrong word, the current dominant way of thinking about operations and infrastructure, sysadminning, whatever you want to call it. When you're doing that, you're not really thinking so much about the developers, right? And so if you're building this stack out, I think the first thing that is easy to overlook, just because you're not kind of used to thinking about this when you're building infrastructure stuff, is that you're building this for developers, like they're your customer. Because the reason you're building this Kubernetes stuff, more or less, is to run those custom written applications that your organization uses. And so as you're building up this stack, you should find some of these developers, because they are the people that you're supporting and that you're, as they say, enabling, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think traditionally, if you look at like, if you're like a virtualization administrator or you're a storage administrator, like you're all these operations things, like you're a little too far removed from the developer side of things. Like you may not even be building infrastructure to run custom written software. You might be running some off-the-shelf thing, or a COTS, as they used to say. You might be doing all this administrative stuff. And so you can't really take that attitude, because then you don't have a customer that you're building this stuff from. And I think that's the important thing to realize, is that you are building a platform, right? And like you're not gonna know what to build unless you know the customer that you're building it for. And you'll just end up building stuff you think is useful and cool and have no validation if it's useful or not. And then you'll have a very well architected city that no one wants to live in.
Good analogy. Well, so the other thing too is you also become the customer, wouldn't you say, in this new model? Because you're not just building it and giving it them to use, you're gonna be part of that same product team with developers.
Right.
And that you have to implement what you built in support of the developers.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, is that when you are building out this new platform, you're gonna have to live with it, right? And so like, you're not gonna have, like, you know, in contrast, if you're using just, you know, VMware virtualization stuff, or you're using the services that you get in a cloud, a public cloud, like, you don't really have a lot of choice in what the thing is. You're more learning how to use something. Whereas a lot of the people I talk with who are building up this platform, they're spending a lot more time customizing it to how they want to run, right? So it's something they're gonna have to live with afterwards. So yeah, it is important to think about as I'm building up this stack, how am I gonna build something I want to use for the next 3 years, if not more? Or how am I gonna improve my resume so I can get out of here?
Yeah, exactly. That's that bimodal thing again.
There you go, that's actually what it was about.
Yes. So then you're gonna, then also without, let me see, besides building infrastructure that's gonna satisfy your customers, which are the developers, and then also making it something that will be usable for you because you're gonna have to support it.
Right.
You're not, you yourselves also have to transition to be this new, to build this new skill set to support those developers.
Right.
So is that going on in parallel? Would you need to transition before you started designing based on the developers' needs?
I think what I would say, I'm still formulating the question in my mind from your question, is what you should start with is by creating the role of a product manager, which I don't think a lot of organizations have at all. Like in the IT world, right? Like you more have architects, project managers, and people who like specify what software is supposed to look like, right? And then the operations layer, like, you know, we have what you do is someone specifies, tell me what the performance characteristics you need for this infrastructure, for this platform, and then tell me all the security requirements that you have, and then I will put together, or I is a collective term, like we will put together a stack of infrastructure and the software above it that provide those capabilities, right? But that's not really how you product manage something, like based on what needs someone has, based on the capabilities that they need. Instead, what you do is you talk directly with your customers, your developers, and you help them discover like what problems they have and the best ways to solve those problems. So for example, like it would be easy to say, and not wholly incorrect, but you would say like, oh, so we're building this platform based on Kubernetes, so we're gonna build out all the storage and the networking and the compute, and then we're gonna get the clusters up and running, and it's really easy to stand up a cluster and put that in and put down, and like, you know, shut down a cluster and it's secure and all of that stuff. And then, you know, what's gonna happen is then you're gonna go to the developers, who you probably haven't really talked with yet, and they're just gonna be like, that's great, I spun up a cluster, and now, I don't know if you know how software development works, but I got a bunch of other stuff I gotta do, right? And so instead, if you start with the developers, you'll find that they do need a place to run their stuff, you know, Kubernetes, blinking cursor, but they also need to be able to do, they need a build tool, right? And they need to something you alluded to is the developers are going to need to know, like, so if the operations people are gonna support this in production, like what do you want me to put in the code so you can monitor it? Like how do you want me to package up the software so that it's easy to diagnose? And what way should I architect things so that it's easy to deploy this stuff like to various data centers, whatever, like all these sorts of
That's
things.
interesting. So the infinite loop starts in the beginning, so that
Right,
you are.
right. And so that's why I was saying, like, you should start talking with developers and realize that they're your customers, right? You're not just building infrastructure and capabilities that kind of map, like, we needed this capability that matches these numbers. Like, you're gonna be co-developing this with developers and product managing it.
So now you all go out and talk to a lot of customers, and so with the ones you're talking to, you've got so we're talking about the operations, you're talking about the app developers, but then there's the common end user customer, right? And so how, and obviously the developers hopefully are thinking directly of what they need to deliver to support the business.
Right.
What about operations? How should they be learning about the end customer? Should they be doing that directly? Because otherwise, if it goes too many layers back, it becomes a game of telephone, and then it gets distorted. So to what extent does operations need to directly understand the end user needs and wants?
Well, I think that, well, I'll do it in reverse order or whatever, but like, so I think it's what operations should think about more is the application development organization as their customer, right? So they should spend most of their time working directly with I'll just say developers, but when I say developers, I mean application developers. Right. They should spend most of their time working with and talking with the developers, because that is very directly their customer. Now, there are, aside from themselves, as you pointed out, there are at least two other constituencies they need to talk with, customers, and that is the security people and the compliance people, right? So these are also going to be customers of theirs that they need to start consulting with, but we're trying to keep things brief.
Right, so those are the internal customer.
Right. And so I think this is true. I mean, I would say that for the most part, that's who operations should talk with. Now, that said, probably, especially when you're starting, you should have a good idea of who your organization's end users, customers are, right? And I would even say that maybe as you have a new operations person come on, what they should probably do is go to those development teams and be like, hey, whatever you're doing to talk to our business's customers, I want to do that for like a few weeks too, or like whatever, right? And so I think somehow you need to figure out your operations people should kind of know what the customers do, right? And people who work in retail and banking, well, at least retail banking, not confusingly put, but like banking that you and I would use, right? They're kind of lucky because they understand what the customers do, right? But as you get into more and more exotic things and also internally facing things, you should probably make sure that at least on a quarterly basis, you check in and you understand what the customers are doing. But it's better to spend all your time focusing on the developers, the security, and the compliance people.
And when you do talk to customers, to add yet another constituency, you've got the business itself, right? Which is, how do you see people organizing the business with the app developers, with operations? Because in theory, business and application developers should be in lockstep. And then, yes, and then operations should be supporting them. But so how do you see the customers you talk to organizing, and how would you advise them to organize?
So I mean, I think there's, I don't know, over the years there's never a great helpful answer to that, right? And because I think you just go through cycles of the chain of people and organizations responsible for the application that the business is using, either internally facing or externally facing, is an external entity to the business, or it's part of the business, right? And I think, I don't know, this is part of the art of product management, and I think that kind of sort of the operations people, again, that's sort of not their concern, right? It's more of the application team should be the one that's figuring out how to work with the business side, right? Because you don't, in the same way that let's reverse it, right? So let's say, I know a lot of IT nerdy people who probably would enjoy this kind of thing, but let's say we're in a retail environment and the business comes over to the operations people, you're not going to talk to them about trucking logistics, or how do I select which stuff to put on the end cap on Tuesdays, right? It's just we don't really need IT to give input on that, right? And similarly, when it gets down to the operations level, the business side doesn't really need to say I don't know, have you considered SSD drives? Or how's our gigadoodles doing?
Right.
There's not really a lot that needs to interface in there. And instead, again, it's the product development people are more of the ones who should be working very closely with the business. And it feels what ends up happening in that area is you have, I mean, it's always a weird phrase, the business, but you have people who are largely non-technical people who understand how the business operates,
Mhm.
right? And they end up working sometimes daily, but very closely with those product managers on the application side. And until you really have those people working on a weekly basis together, like, you don't really have the good the synergizing between the two of them. But again, like, I mean, I don't know. This is always not, I don't know if this is the answer that people like, but like, I don't know, when it comes to operations people, just worry about the developers.
Okay, well, that's good advice. So if we end with a lightning round,
Sure.
I'll give you some things and you just say the first thing that comes into your mind, but.
Ice cream.
Yes, thank you, and you win, thank you, everyone. No, okay, Kubernetes.
I don't know.
What's gonna happen to it? What should we keep in
Oh, I
mind?
thought this is the first thing that comes into my
Well,
head.
I changed the rules, but.
I was thinking koala for some
Yes,
reason.
exactly.
Probably because they both start with K.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like every kiss begins with K.
Yes, okay.
Hey,
Oh, that's
you ended it with K.
Jewelry, okay.
So, I think, yeah, I mean, I think after a long time of all of us in the industry trying to figure it out, like, yeah, that seems to be what people want to run. Like, I think the most interesting thing with Kubernetes, like I was realizing this on stage today, is I should stop saying public cloud and I should just say cloud. Because like there used to be, and there still is a distinction of public versus private cloud and things like that. But like I think increasingly, like, you know, when people say cloud, they just mean like the big public cloud stuff, right? And so what I'm curious with Kubernetes is like if you're just using public cloud or cloud stuff, like, do you need that? Like, and like, I guess another way of putting it is like, is all this interest in Kubernetes, is that a private cloud thing or a multi-cloud thing? But if you just wanted to use just one of the big public clouds, like, does Kubernetes, is it really necessary? And I don't know, I mean, I think you could equivocate. I always forget if equivocate means what I think it does, but
Probably doesn't go on.
you could, you know, either answer, I could totally see that, you know, it goes either way. But I think that'll be the, I think that's what's in store in the future, is figuring out, like, do we need this thing if we're not doing our own, building our own, like, data centers and private cloud stuff, or edge.
Right. Well, and so,
Always the edge.
Yes, exactly. So that brings up and this isn't very lightning now, we're kind of getting to longer answers, but.
It's more like a rolling thunder.
I like that. The multi-cloud, when you hear multi-cloud, because you just started talking about distinctions, delineations that you see going away, do you see multi-cloud as as a helpful term, and B, do you see it as a reality in that, like, would you say that would become the reality, that it's just this pastiche of public cloud, private cloud, and then a mixture where you're bursting over and a bunch of different configurations?
So mostly the second. Like nowadays, whenever I see the phrase or hear the phrase multi-cloud, I try to substitute in the word computers. And what I mean by that is, like we used to have this phrase, heterogeneous IT, which just meant like Windows, Linux, Unix mainframes. And from an IT person's, from the IT department's perspective, it's like, oh yeah, we got all of that, right? And so what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to support and manage everything, right? Like we don't only have Windows, whatever. And so like, when I hear the phrase multi-cloud, what it's come to mean to me is like, oh yeah, we're gonna be running stuff in the public cloud, and we got some stuff over here, and we got edge,
Right.
And then we've got this thing. And again, in the scope of all of the stuff that I care about is scope to like an organization that is writing and running their own software that helps run their business, right? I think that an organization of any size that I end up talking with, which is large, right? They just like, you know, they got a lot of different stuff. And so they would like to have as few tools and as few things to manage all of that as possible. So in that sense, like, and so I kind of go over that because I think when a lot of people say multi-cloud, the feeling that I get is they're talking about, we're going to build a system and an architecture of a new thing that involves multiple clouds, which sounds cool, right? Like you said the word bursting, which is awesome, right? Like such a fun word.
Right.
But like, really what I think it means is just like, yeah, we got a whole bunch of different stuff that like is not really compatible with each other, but we need to have a bunch of tools and ways of thinking that allow us to like manage all of it.
Right, so it's something that happens more organically than something that you plan, and it's more from the outside, inside out, as opposed to outside in.
Sure.
At least in my head, I'm guessing.
Some people like to go both ways.
Yeah, exactly, here, there, and everywhere. So if we talk about DevOps, because that's what you go out and talk about, how are you positioning that now? This is not lightning round anymore. We're getting back into some topics, but how are you positioning that to people? To customers? Are you saying, really, you should be focusing on this instead? Are you saying DevOps is going to transition to that? Or are you still pretty much using that as the framing for your discussions?
Yeah. I mean, I think to answer your question in a circuitous way, for once.
Yes.
I think what I try to emphasize is a lot of what we were just talking about. There's two things I try to emphasize. One, I try to figure out if I'm talking to developers or operations people, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm talking to developers, I have a different sort of like prattle that I go through.
And once again, you said app developers.
Yes,
in this case.
yeah. I'm sophisticated enough to know there's like many types of developers.
Yes, good.
That, but I believe that when most people say developers, they mean application developers.
Right.
So I shorten it that way because I love concision.
Right.
And so I think that, so if I'm talking with operations people, the conversation I try to have with them is what we've been talking about. Is like, so you're going to be building and supporting a platform, right? I try to use this word platform instead of DevOps.
Okay.
And what comes with that is like, sure, DevOps, right? But like it's not in a bad way. It's just, it's too much of a term. And so I try to narrow it down to like, what you need to do is you're building a platform. And then we've discussed that already, right? But I try to steer this conversation towards like, so if there were operations people who are now building a platform that's gonna run the software in a multi-cloud environment or whatever, like here is generally the way people go about doing that, what the platform looks like, and all of that sort of stuff. Instead of kind of like going through the more traditional like, well, DevOps, you gotta automate this thing, and then DevOps.
CAMs, culture, automation, measurements.
Sure. Which is all
right.
is all great, but I think
Right.
like, I think we're all cool with that, right?
Either that or it's something that confuses people, and I think either way, I like the idea of focusing on platform because it becomes something that's tangible.
Yeah.
I think since day one, the thing that has plagued DevOps is the multitude of meanings and the sort of the fuzziness around it. We all have sort of the same idea, but particularly people coming new to the concept or trying to get to a second level of understanding, platform is very helpful and easier to wrap your head around.
And if I may meta comment on myself further.
Yes, please.
Like I feel like I always want to tell people something they can do, not like some state they should be in, right? Like and so like there's a great place for in the computer world, the DevOps world, the product management world, all worlds of kind of saying like, wouldn't it be better if things were like this? And sort of pointing out like, this culture over here is horrible and this culture is better, right? And like, I've read all of that stuff and listened to it, but I always ask, like the frame that I have in my mind is like, all right, so this conference was fun, and then I'm gonna come back on Monday and like I gotta do something.
Right.
So like, what am I gonna do, right? And so like, I haven't mentioned a lot of concrete things that you can do, but that's what I always want to drive towards is like, even if it's small, like what's something you can actually start doing? So for example, have you talked with developers recently? Why don't you hire a product? Why don't you create a product manager role and go talk with the application developers and find out what they need, right? Like never, like you're gonna end up building a platform. Like most of us who are on the outside, we can tell you what you're gonna end up doing, right? But you're gonna end up doing it in a slightly different way, and all those little edge cases and slightly different things are gonna be what matters. So like, we know what you're gonna end up doing, but first, just call up developers, find out your VP of applications or whatever nonsense is, and just talk with them and ask them what their deal is, how you can help them, what they need, and start there. Because you already know you're gonna build some Kubernetes thing. Like, what else are you gonna do?
Exactly, a platform to manage platforms.
Yes,
As
but
we
you need
talked.
some guidance, or you're just gonna end up with like something that people don't want to is too strong, just like something that doesn't apply, like that is a mismatch for what people actually need.
Yeah, and just thinking more as you're talking about platform, I like it because you don't necessarily have to be talking about a specific platform like a Tanzu or an OpenShift.
Well, you always have to talk about a Tanzu.
Yes, exactly. I'm sorry, I forget who you work for, but just the concept of whatever it is that's going to support application development and that's going to be supported by operations, that is what you can call a platform. Whether
Right.
Whether it's a prepackaged bundle that you get, whether it's your own your own platform that you build.
Right.
I think that.
And then the other tangible thing, right, is that like, and this is why it's important to go start talking to developers, is like, from a operation standpoint, you focus on running the application, right? I mean, if you think about the process, it's sort of like someone gives me an application, I configure it and set it up, and now it's running in production. And then something goes wrong, and I figure out what's wrong with it. And those, I mean, I'm ludicrously whatevering it, but like that's kind of what's going on there. But if your customer is a developer, there's a lot more that's going on. So for example, your developers will have like a pipeline, like a whole process of how they ingest what the software needs to do, how they build it out, how they test it, how they automate things, like all sorts of things, right? And as you build out your platform, you're gonna find that like, oh, I guess you're gonna shift left. Like, I should get involved in those tools more and more. And that's, I think, what a lot of DevOps groups do nowadays is they build these developer tools, but that also becomes part of this orbit of a platform that is something different than operations people do.
Yeah, and I should also, once again, thinking while you're talking.
I should do more thinking while I talk.
Exactly, and that's something I could do as well. But it doesn't mean, when I'm getting back to this idea of platform and you focus on, doesn't mean that you don't, that DevOps is not helpful. As I've thought about it, DevOps is the methodology that underpins modern IT, and modern IT is characterized by a platform model.
I mean, if you think about it, at the beginning, like DevOps was like Puppet and Chef and obligatory 3 other companies you always have to mention, right? But basically DevOps was, we don't like the way that automation is currently done. We want to make automation more programmable, right? In fact, depending on which way you went, like it was just a programming language or it was a DSL or whatever you want to call it. But we want to start having infrastructure as code, right? And so it wasn't a platform. The whole thing of DevOps was that we are going to program our infrastructure, right? It's going to be more programmatic versus whatever else was before that, right? And so like
floppy disks that you walked around and you upgraded servers.
That's right. And then as DevOps has progressed, like it always sways back and forth between like the technology and the culture, right? It goes.
One thing that I like that Patrick Dubois said was he called it technical gravity, gravity of technology. Basically that you try to pull it more to culture, et cetera, and you always get sent back to the tools.
I mean, it always goes back, right? Because the two things enable each other, right? Like you get a new sort of technology, like when the automation people came along, that freed up a lot of time, and you had a new approach to doing it, which means
Jevons paradox. That's where.
Yeah, that's right. Which means you could focus on changing the culture, and then you change the culture around long enough, and you haven't been focusing on the technology, and then the culture is in a good state, and you got to go back and like there's new technology. Now all of a sudden you've got containers that you can work with, and that changes the stack, and so you've got to spend some time in the technology, and then you go back up to the culture. So.
Right. So you go from Puppet and Chef to Docker.
Right, and then so forth and so on, and now, like a lot of us in the industry were just sort of farting around trying to figure out what we're going to do with Kubernetes or not do with Kubernetes. And finally, that's more or less resolved. And so now it's back to like the people who are doing DevOps or whatever, like now it's sort of like, hey, here's the new box of stuff you need to do. So like, I think things hopefully are swaying back towards technology where it's just like, now we need to get Kubernetes up and running, which is why, going back to what you're saying, like the important thing there is that like what you're building is a platform, right? Like you're not just, it's not like the good times of the early days of DevOps where like, really all you need to do is write a bunch of Puppet and Chef scripts and you get an A+, right? You've done the DevOps. Whereas now it's more of like, you need to build a platform that your organization is going to use to make application development better, right? And that's like the technological focus that you have. So do that platform stuff.
It's interesting because there are so many more dependencies, and Kubernetes is so much more involved and intricate to set up and maintain. It is a bit of a black box compared, and I may be wrong, but to Puppet and Chef, they seem to come out from the beginning being more fully formed, that there was less sort of setup you had to do. So while we talked about traditionally with DevOps, as we talked about this culture, it's the most important thing, because if your culture doesn't change, then it doesn't matter how many great tools you have, because they're going to languish because people won't know how to use them. But to your point, okay, so you've got all these people who are raring to go, and they understand the new way, and they're looking forward to working together. But if they can't make Kubernetes work, they're in a world of hurt. So it is that balancing act.
Yeah, no, you need both of them, right? Like to repeat what you're saying, if you have, I don't know, you're like in whatever the right column of the Westeros corporate Westerium Rorschach thing is, you know, like you got the bureaucratic, like, and then you've got like whatever one's in the middle. And
Is this a 1984 reference?
Yeah, it's the Westerum thing that's in all of the big DevOps reports, right?
Okay.
Like, so let's say you've got the good generative culture,
Okay.
right? And then let's say your tools are crap.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't matter, right? Like you have this generative culture that everything, they're all pulling the right way, they've got all the characteristics. And then it's like, all right, now let's do this stuff. And they're like, well, we've got to go to the training that tells us how to fill out the tickets correctly to get a server, right? So that's my point, is that like, you can't dismiss culture and you can't dismiss technology. Like, you need both of them. And if one of them is bad, including the technology, then the other one is irrelevant, right? Like you could have, for example, I mean, my little joke is always like, you could have great technology and all that gets you is this blinking cursor, right? Like, you still need to do something with it. So anyhow, that's why it's good to like figure out, like, don't get over fixated on just one of those other things of the continuously swaying thing. Go like this.
Right. And
does that work?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. You can't have one without the other. And I think, I don't know, back to that technical gravity, if that tends to be the natural pull of or natural swing of culture versus technology, that tends to be the 60 to the 40 or the 70 to the 30, but whatever it is, you still can't have it without the other component.
Yeah, and it may be attached to that is like, it's really easy to stop talking with your customer, right? And like that's, whether you're an application developer or operations person or whatever layer, like that's why I try to always emphasize like what is your business? Like, what is it that your organization does? Who is the customer that you work indirectly and directly with? How do you make things better for them, right? And like every single, like, at least in the area that we're talking about, every single, like, I don't know if the person who, like, you know, orders the Xerox paper, you know, well, I don't know, they can do whatever they like, right? But like, you know, you always have to know, like, I don't like that whole, like, you have to know your why, because it's sort of like, also I need to breathe regularly, like, you know, but like, you need to know why you're doing this, like, who is the customer for it. And like, I think what happens a lot is whether you're building a technology or you're perfecting the culture, like, it's easy to kind of lose track of the customer or the outcome. And so you always got to go check back on them and be like, so we made this generative culture. Is it like selling more stuff, right? Like, is it working? And like, is it making it easier for Barton to file his taxes, right? Like, you know, you've always got to go back and make sure that whoever your customer is, that like you're actually making things better for them, regardless of how great you're doing, right? Yeah,
and that's the whole idea of this being an infinite loop. There is no stasis. You can't say, we got the requirements, we're done, we'll talk to you another 10 years, because things happen too quickly.
Right,
this is this continuous feedback loop that is so important. Whether you do the full-blown DevOps model or not, that in itself is something simple, but something very important to realize, that things are always moving, and you want to be, as you say, checking back with your customers. checking back and seeing what they're needing. And that's, say, in a simple example of consumer goods, you're obviously always taking track of what kind of scents are important for shampoos, or what are the dentifrice, as they say, toothpaste, how those are trending. What are the things in toothbrushes, man? They have so many different bells and whistles they keep coming up with. You would never think of not continuously checking with those customers.
Right.
But maybe say within IT, you say, hey, got it, I know what the developers want, I'm good. But that changes, and you also need their learning as you go as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, toothbrushes are a fun analogy, right? Because it almost seems like, capitalism gone amok. Just like, how many types of toothbrushes do we really need?
And with like $9 for a toothbrush, I mean, it's crazy. I was in oral care at Johnson & Johnson. I did dental floss. You don't have to floss them all, just the ones you want to keep. $100 million brand, and this was like 20 years ago. It's crazy. So yes, but you always do have to stay up with the latest. And capitalism run amok, as you say, because people, whether people need it or not, there's always this differentiation that they seem to be seeking, some of which is warranted, some of which is just, let's throw something out there and maybe people will buy toothbrushes that have 3 heads that spin.
Right. Exactly. And, you want to experiment and try new things out and explore it and get feedback, and if it works, do more of it. That's always a good idea if something works in your business. And if it doesn't work, then stop doing it, right? And so, but it is getting that loop in place where you're making sure all the way down to the infrastructure and operation stuff, is this stuff working out? Is it good? And in order to answer that question, you've got to know who the customer is. Is it making the application developers' jobs better? And then when you make their jobs better, the customer of the business, the end user, as you say, they should be improving as well.
And I think that part of the Agile manifesto and part of the DevOps ethos is the quick feedback loops, right? So that you're not putting out big deployments, but you have things in bits so you can do quick rollbacks. So I think that would be one of the big differences between that and the toothbrush market, is to get a toothbrush out there, to get it in place in Walmart, etc. That's a lot trickier because you have it all the way out there and you're pretty far extended, you make pretty big investment. And in the past, people have done that with Oracle deployments or things where you've had to spend 2 years on it to get it anywhere. But with the idea of, with DevOps and with Agile, it's let's get this loop quicker so that we don't make any mistakes we can't pull back, and B, we're able to match the needs of the customers as they go on.
Well, let's see if I can make this statement without having it be useless. But I think the traditional way, which is to say the current way of thinking about operation stuff, is that you build what you can, right? You have this stuff and you build up what is possible, right? Whereas what you were just describing there is instead you should build kind of what you need in the sense of what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to deploy our software every week. So let's work back from there. That's the goal that we have, right? And so I know that sounds ludicrous, but tell me, and I don't know, this is someone talking to the operations people, right? What is it that you would need to support that, right? And I know with our current way of thinking about stuff and the infrastructure we do, it just seems ludicrous, kind of installing some big packaged application. But there are many companies and organizations that manage to do this, so I know it's possible, right? And so what do we need to do to get to the point where we can safely deploy and run our software every week? And let's start from there, right? Never mind all this nonsense, not nonsense, but all the constraints and the problems that we have over here, but that's what it is, I think, to build a platform. Start with that goal in mind, not with well, we have all this stuff and we can build stuff with it, right? Maybe that stuff you have isn't useful, right? And so you need to come up, that's why you're building a new platform instead of just for example, you could be we got all these computers and we're just gonna install Kubernetes on them. And then we're gonna have a Kubernetes cluster up and running and it's gonna be great, and then we'll have that. So we built this thing, and then a good test is to be all right, so how would a developer get a cluster? And then Sometimes the answer is like, oh, well, they need to file a ticket. And you need to be like, no, hold on. I think we lost track of what's going on here, right? So, again, I think it's good to start with that end goal of like, let's start way up here. We want to deploy our software every week. What does that imply, and work back from there instead of working up.
Right, and then work forward in incremental ways, because you're not going to say, this is where we want to be, so let's throw everything out that we have and let's buy new everything to get it going. Is that you say, once again, you've got your roadmap, this is where we need to be, this is what we've got, let's slowly start replacing things, let's figure out how we can use what we have, modified versions of that to support the new system. Because otherwise it's a loss in expenditure, capital expenditure, and also you don't quite know how to use the new things, and I think it would be madness.
Yeah. So start small on some projects, find your customer.
Yep.
Just experiment, try things out, and I'll always consult with the customers that you have and see how that's working out, and do stuff to help them. And I should say, for both our respective companies, if you want to buy everything brand new, that is totally cool too.
Yes, exactly. In fact, I'll put a link in here that has direct use of Salesforce, and sales ticket that you can form and buy.
File a ticket.
Yes, exactly. So, well, with that, Michael Cote, it's been a pleasure as always. I think I've learned something from here. I hope our viewers and listeners. Oh, stop it some more. And on that note, signing out from DevOps Days, Dallas Fort Worth, number 5. Thank you.
Bye.